Balmoral Castle. October wind curling around its ancient stone walls. King Charles III, now 76, sat beneath the same towering elm tree he'd once climbed as a child. It was just meant to be a quiet royal engagement, a photo opportunity with journalists. Nothing more. But then came the question, simple, almost playful. Your Majesty, after all these years, who was the true love of your life? At first Charles smiled. The practiced, camera-safe smile of a monarch. But something changed. His gaze drifted beyond the reporters toward the rolling Scottish hills. His posture shifted. And then came the answer, honest, unscripted, and devastatingly real. Lucia, he said quietly. Lucia Santa Cruz. The journalists blinked. One even lowered their pen. Not Camilla. Not Diana. But Lucia? In that moment, the image of King Charles, the man shaped by centuries of royal tradition, marriages, scandals, and crown, was rewritten. He wasn't just a monarch. He was a man who had loved deeply, lost quietly, and had never truly healed. The headlines the next day didn't hold back. King Charles named secret first love. Lucia, the woman who captured the king's soul. Camilla not his true love after all? And the question on everyone's mind echoed like thunder. Who was this Lucia? Before duty. Before Diana. Before Camilla. There was Lucia. Lucia Santa Cruz was no ordinary woman. She wasn't a duchess. She wasn't nobility. She wasn't even British. She was the daughter of the Chilean ambassador, an academic, and a firestorm of intellect and charm. She met Charles in the late 1960s while he was studying at Cambridge, and from the very beginning something clicked. She challenged him, not just with wit but with ideas. She introduced him to poetry, art, and philosophy. She spoke to him as an equal, not as a prince. And in doing so, she reached a part of him no one else ever had. Charles was still in his early 20s, awkward, introspective, burdened by the expectations of monarchy. But with Lucia he felt free. She called him Carlos, the Spanish version of his name, and laughed without fear in rooms filled with tradition. Their connection was electric, intellectual, and profoundly emotional. They shared long walks through the gardens of Trinity College, debated politics over late-night dinners, and spoke of a future that would never come to pass. It was a brief romance, but it left a mark that time never erased. But like so many royal stories, theirs was doomed from the start. Lucia was Catholic, a foreigner, and most of all not seen as suitable by palace standards. The royal machinery, the same institution that had crushed so many loves before, stepped in. Firm hands guided Charles away, while Lucia quietly left the stage. But her impact would never leave him. When Lucia Santa Cruz left his life, Charles buried the loss the only way royals know how, with silence. He moved forward. Not emotionally but publicly. Duty, after all, has a way of compressing the soul. But even silence has its echoes, and it wasn't long before the void she left began tugging at him again. If Lucia had stirred his mind, Camilla stirred something more primal, his ease. She was smart, sharp-tongued, effortlessly confident, and completely unconcerned with his title. She mocked him playfully, teased him about his brooding moods, and didn't treat him like a prince at all. For Charles that was intoxicating. They met in 1970 at a polo match. Charles was captivated almost instantly. Camilla shared his love for the countryside, for horses, for long, rambling conversations over tea. She had the energy of someone who didn't care what others thought, and for Charles, who had spent his life being scrutinized, that felt like a breath of fresh air. But love's timing is rarely fair. By the time things became serious, Camilla was already involved with another man, Andrew Parker Bowles. The relationship was complicated, off and on, full of fiery passion and unpredictable turns. Still, Charles was slow to act. The crown always loomed in the background, whispering rules and warnings. He hesitated. And while he was away serving in the Navy, Camilla made her choice. She married Andrew. That decision broke something in Charles. He returned to find the door closed, the one woman who made him feel normal now forever out of reach. And so, under mounting pressure from the royal family and public expectation, he did what was expected of him. He looked for a bride. Diana Spencer entered the picture not long after. Young, aristocratic, beautiful. The perfect fit on paper. Charles remembered the first time he saw her clearly, at her family's estate in Althorpe. She was just 16, vibrant and full of light. He was 29. The age difference was substantial, but in her innocence he saw possibility. Not passion, not intellectual connection, but hope. A fresh start. Their courtship was fast. Too fast. They married in 1981, in a ceremony watched by 750 million people across the globe. The world cheered. But Charles? He remained conflicted. The cracks showed early hesitation in interviews, stiffness in body language, a famous moment when he was asked, "Are you in love?" and answered, "Whatever in love means." Still he tried. They both did. But the ghosts of his past, Lucia, Camilla, and the life he'd never truly chosen, weighed him down. And just when he thought he had closed that chapter forever, Lucia reappeared, with a twist no one saw coming. It was years later, mid-1980s, when Lucia Santa Cruz quietly returned into Charles's orbit. Not through romance but through friendship. She had moved on with her life, married and built a career of her own. But for Charles, seeing her again felt like touching a wound that had never truly healed. She hadn't changed much. Still sharp. Still radiant. But this time there were no stolen kisses or romantic strolls. What Lucia offered now was something even more valuable: perspective. She became his confidant once more. Someone outside the palace walls who understood both his public burdens and private struggles. Someone who had once loved the man behind the prince, and still cared for him without needing anything in return. Charles's marriage to Diana was unraveling. The emotional gap between them had widened into a canyon. Diana wanted vulnerability, honesty, rawness. Charles didn't know how to give that. Not with the weight of duty crushing his shoulders. Not with the ghosts of two great loves, one unresolved, one forbidden, still hovering around him. And then Lucia once again changed everything. She reached out to Camilla. Yes, the very woman Charles had once let slip away. Lucia saw what no one else had seen clearly: Camilla and Charles were still tethered, even across years and marriages. She arranged a quiet dinner. Just friends. Just conversation. But one dinner became another. Then another. And the bond reignited. This time it was different. They were older. More seasoned. Charles was a father. Camilla was still married. The risks were enormous. The potential scandal, nuclear. But they didn't stop. And soon the world found out. When recordings of Charles's private phone conversations with Camilla leaked in 1993, vulgar, intimate, shockingly raw, the public turned on him. The Prince of Wales became a punchline. His approval ratings plummeted. Diana's quiet dignity, her tears and courage, made her the global icon of sympathy. Charles became the villain. And yet, behind closed doors, something strange happened. Lucia stood by him. She didn't run from the mess. She offered support, guidance, and in moments when he was most lost, grace. She helped him write his speeches. She advised him on how to navigate the media nightmare. She reminded him, over and over again, that truth will always find its way to the surface. But even as he rebuilt his life with Camilla by his side, Charles still kept a box of letters hidden away, written not to Diana, not to Camilla, but to Lucia. The years rolled on, and Charles's life took its predictable turns: divorce, public rebuke, eventual redemption. Diana's tragic death in 1997 stunned the world and shifted the public perception of the royal family in an irreversible way. For a time, Charles became a ghost of himself. Silent. Withdrawn. Shattered by the guilt, the loss, and the fear that his children might never forgive him. Yet again, it was Lucia who appeared in the shadows of his grief, not with grand gestures, but with quiet presence. She visited him at Highgrove not to lecture or console but to be there. No cameras. No headlines. Just two old souls who once shared something sacred. Charles never remarried until 2005. Camilla, after years of careful media repair, became his wife. The ceremony was modest, private, with Queen Elizabeth herself initially absent from the civil service. Many saw it as a love that had finally conquered scandal. But what they didn't know was this: on the morning of his wedding day, Charles wrote a single-page letter and placed it in his private safe. The letter was addressed to Lucia. No one knew the contents. Not his aides, not Camilla, not even William or Harry. But what royal staff later confirmed was that Charles asked the letter to be preserved with his personal effects. To be read only when I am gone. The mystery of that letter stirred speculation for years. Meanwhile, Charles settled into married life with Camilla. The media softened. Time passed. And when Queen Elizabeth II died in 2022, Charles finally ascended the throne, King Charles III. A role he had waited for all his life. A crown he once confessed to Lucia he never truly wanted. And that's when the weight of the past began to surface again. During his coronation preparations, aides discovered that Charles had kept an old chest filled with journals, personal letters, and sketches from his youth. At the very bottom were bundles of faded correspondence, all addressed to L. No last name. No royal seal. And they weren't just love letters. They were confessions, doubts, poems, reflections about the monarchy, about duty, about fear, and about love. They told the story of a man who had been trapped in tradition, who had worn a mask for most of his life, and who only ever took it off in one person's presence. And that brings us back to Balmoral, and the quiet, seismic moment where Charles's truth finally broke through the crown. It was supposed to be just another royal engagement. A ceremonial planting of a tree at Balmoral to honor a new sustainability initiative. Reporters were invited. Cameras were ready. Nothing unexpected. Until a young journalist, fresh to the royal beat, broke protocol with a question that pierced the polished atmosphere like a blade. "Your Majesty, may I ask something personal?" Charles looked up, amused. "You may try," he said. The journalist hesitated, then asked, "After everything, decades of public life, love, loss, who would you say was the true love of your life?" A hush fell over the courtyard. Charles didn't laugh. He didn't deflect. Instead, his shoulders dropped slightly, and for once, he looked not like a king, but like a man who had carried too many unspoken truths for too long. "It's a name most of you don't know," he said, "and one you likely wouldn't expect. But I suppose at this point in life, truth matters more than image." A long pause. A deep breath. "Lucia," he said, eyes fixed on the hills. "Not Camilla. Not Diana. Lucia Santa Cruz." The response hit like thunder. He continued, voice low, steady, "She was the first person who ever saw me. Not as a title. Not as a duty. As a man. She knew me before the cameras, before the expectations. She taught me how to think, how to question. How to feel." The gathered press leaned forward, stunned. "I love Diana deeply. And Camilla is my anchor. But Lucia was my soul's mirror." One reporter whispered, "Is she still in your life?" "She's never left," he replied. And then came the most stunning line of all, the one that would make international headlines. "She was the first person I ever told I didn't want to be king." The crowd fell dead silent. Charles nodded slowly. "She said, then don't be king. Be Charles." I didn't listen. I wish I had, sometimes. But if I hadn't worn this crown, I may never have understood what love really is. The cameras kept rolling, but the king seemed unaware. Or perhaps finally he didn't care. He had spoken his truth. The footage went viral within hours. Social media exploded. Television networks ran it on repeat. Analysts, historians, and royal watchers scrambled to reframe decades of speculation. For the first time, a monarch had publicly revealed the quiet love who had shaped him in the shadows. Someone who had never sought attention, fame, or favor. Back inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, the mood was very different. Senior aides were in crisis mode. Damage control meetings were called. Protocol officers scrambled to assess whether the king's confession had breached any formal lines. Had he undermined the dignity of the queen consort? Would it trigger a constitutional stir? How would the press spin this in the days ahead? Palace insiders later described the atmosphere as tense, borderline panicked. But the biggest question was about Camilla. The queen consort had endured more than her fair share of public scorn, especially in the early years. She had been called a homewrecker, a villain, a disgrace. But she had stayed, through whispers, headlines, and awkward family gatherings. She stood by Charles when his popularity was at rock bottom. And now, after decades of quiet loyalty, her husband had gone on camera to tell the world that another woman was the love of his life. She didn't say much that evening. Sources say she retired early to her private sitting room and didn't speak to Charles for 2 full days. When she did, it wasn't a shouting match. There were no slammed doors. Just a firm conversation, one that ended with Camilla leaving for her country home alone that weekend. Meanwhile, the media frenzy grew louder. Royal love triangle, the final chapter? Was Camilla always second best? King Charles's secret heart revealed. Public sentiment split down the middle. Some saw Charles's confession as brave, an old man finally sharing the truth after a lifetime of silence. Others called it selfish, insensitive, even cruel. "It's romantic," one viral tweet read. "He carried this love all his life and never used it for gain. That's real love." Another user countered, "Imagine being married to someone who goes on global TV to say someone else was their true soulmate." Even members of parliament made snide remarks. One MP was quoted saying, "If the king spent less time on personal memoirs and more time on policy, perhaps the public would trust the monarchy more." The pressure mounted. An official palace statement was issued, sterile, polished, and utterly emotionless. His Majesty the King has always cherished the many relationships that have shaped his life. He remains devoted to Her Majesty the Queen and grateful for her continued service and strength. It didn't help. Behind the scenes, Charles was facing a new kind of storm, not from the press but from his own family. Some members of the royal circle, especially those aligned with Diana's legacy, were furious. Others were merely confused. And yet, in the middle of it all, Charles remained still, quiet, unapologetic. But what happened next wasn't a press leak or a family drama. It was a move by Lucia herself, one that would change how the world saw her, and how history would remember the king. Just when the public assumed Lucia Santa Cruz would retreat into silence, as she always had, she stepped forward in a way that no one expected. It wasn't a tell-all interview. It wasn't a book deal or a Netflix series. It was a quiet essay published in the Times titled simply, "A Life Lived in the Margins of a Crown." The byline read, "Lucia Santa Cruz, Historian." The article was short, graceful, and devastatingly human. "I was never meant to be remembered," she wrote. "I never asked for a role in the royal story. I simply existed beside it, like a shadow walks beside the sun." She described meeting Charles when he was a shy, unsure young man with the weight of centuries pressing down on him. "He was thoughtful, curious, kind, and deeply lonely," she said. "We spoke of ideas, not legacies. Of music, not duty. Of identity, not image. But the part that hit the hardest came near the end. I have loved him as a young man, as a friend, as a king. But I do not wish to be inserted into a triangle I never belonged to. I was not Diana. I am not Camilla. I am simply Lucia. And I loved Charles in a way that required nothing from him." She ended her piece with a single sentence that brought tears to millions. "Some loves are not meant to be worn like a crown, they are meant to be carried like a secret." The article went viral instantly. People were stunned not by scandal, but by the sheer grace of it. Lucia became an icon overnight, not for being a lover but for being a symbol of quiet dignity. Even Camilla, it was said, was moved. 1 week later she returned to London, appeared beside Charles at a charity event, and smiled, not the forced royal kind but a real one. She hadn't forgiven everything perhaps, but she understood it. Because the truth is, love is rarely simple. And when you live your life under a crown, it is even messier. What Charles had given the world was not scandal, it was vulnerability. And Lucia with her essay had given it context. A week after the publication, Charles and Lucia were spotted together one last time, seated at a quiet bench on the palace grounds. No photographers were allowed. No official record remains. But one staff member described it as two old friends laughing in the wind. And perhaps that's all it ever was. Or all it ever needed to be. In the final chapter of his life, King Charles III would not be remembered solely for his reign, or his controversial path to the throne. He would not be defined only by the women who had shared his life in the public spotlight. Instead, what lingered in the hearts of millions was the quiet truth he revealed at 76. Truth about love, identity, and the cost of always doing what's expected. His admission changed more than headlines. It changed how people viewed him. For years he had been criticized as aloof, awkward, even cold. But after that moment beneath the elm tree, a new portrait of Charles emerged. Not just a monarch, but a man who had suffered, sacrificed, and carried unspoken love for decades. His bond with Lucia never turned into a romantic reunion. They never held hands at public events, never exchanged vows. But in many ways, their connection outlasted all the formal relationships in his life. It lived in letters, in memories, in private conversations that shaped who Charles became when the cameras weren't looking. Historians now refer to Lucia Santa Cruz as the quiet queen of the king's heart. She never wore a tiara, never gave a speech from a balcony, but her presence shaped a monarch more than most could see. And Camilla? Despite the emotional blow, she remained by Charles's side until the end. Their relationship, though scarred by the public's perception and Charles's late-life confession, stood the test of time. She was the woman who shared the burden of the throne, who gave him stability and resilience. Their bond was real, just different. In a speech 2 years after his confession, Charles said, "Love, in its many forms, is what makes life worth living. Some loves burn bright and fast. Some stay quietly like a lantern you never quite let go of. I've known both. And I'm grateful." He would go on to rule with a softer edge. A little more transparency. A little more heart. And when he passed, the world didn't just mourn a king. It mourned a man who finally, after decades of silence, told the truth about the one who had seen him before the world ever did. On his writing desk, A final note was found, folded neatly in an envelope addressed to his sons. Read. Be kind. Be brave. And love someone who sees you, not for who they want you to be but for who you are. That is your true north. I learned that too late. Don't make the same mistake. History has many kings, but few ever dared to be fully human. Charles did. And that's how he will be remembered.